You fit the description and I'm not arguing about it.
Sir, I've done nothing wrong. You can verify my identity through dispatch.
Don't start talking like you're above this. I know what I'm looking at.
You're looking at a federal judge.
I don't care who you claim to be. Turn around.
The handcuffs click shut around her wrists at 9:47 p.m. Judge Claudia Brennan, a federal district court judge with 17 years on the bench, stood in the fluorescent glow of a gas station parking lot, arms pulled behind her back, while Officer Dennis Kovac told her to stop resisting. She wasn't resisting. She was asking questions, and apparently that was enough. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would get cleared up in 5 minutes. This was a veteran police officer looking at a black woman in business attire pumping gas and deciding she must be a criminal. What happened next would trigger a Department of Justice investigation, destroy multiple careers, and send a clear message about what happens when you handcuff a federal judge for absolutely no reason. The gas station sat on the corner of Westfield Avenue and Route 22, one of those brightly lit spots that stays open all night, serving coffee and lottery tickets to whoever needs them. Judge Brennan had stopped there after working late at the courthouse, reviewing case files for a complex fraud trial set to begin the following week. She wore a navy blue suit, her judicial robes long since hung up in her chambers. Her car, a silver sedan, sat at pump number 4. Officer Kovac pulled into the gas station at 9:43 p.m., 4 minutes before everything went sideways. He was responding to a call about a stolen vehicle in the area. The description was minimal. A dark-colored sedan, possibly silver or gray, occupied by a black female. No plate number, no make or model, no distinguishing features. Just those few details broadcast over the radio 20 minutes earlier. Kovac scanned the gas station and saw Judge Brennan's vehicle. Silver sedan, black woman. In his mind, that was probable cause. He didn't run the plates. He didn't call for backup. He didn't observe any suspicious behavior. He simply decided this must be his suspect and approached with his hand already resting on his duty weapon. Judge Brennan noticed the patrol car but thought nothing of it. Police stopped at this station regularly. She finished pumping her gas, replaced the nozzle, and was reaching for her receipt when Kovac's voice cut through the night air. He ordered her to step away from the vehicle and put her hands where he could see them. She turned, confused. The officer was standing 15 feet away, positioned behind his open car door, hand still on his weapon. Judge Brennan asked what the problem was. Simple question, reasonable under the circumstances. Kovac's response was to repeat his command, louder this time, telling her this was her last warning before he considered her non-compliant. Here's what Judge Brennan did next, and pay attention because this part matters. She calmly stated her name and title. She explained she was a federal judge returning home from work. She offered to show identification. She suggested the officer verify her identity through dispatch. She kept her hands visible. Her voice remained steady. Everything she did was textbook de-escalation. Kovac heard none of it. Or rather, he heard it and decided it was a lie. In his mind, criminals claim to be anything when confronted. Doctor, lawyer, judge, whatever might get them out of trouble. The more insistent she became about her identity, the more convinced he grew that she was lying. He told her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Judge Brennan asked to speak with a supervisor. Kovac said she could do that at the station. She asked what crime she was suspected of committing. Kovac said she matched the description of a suspect. She asked what description. He told her to stop talking and comply. The gas station security cameras captured everything. The footage would later become Exhibit A in multiple investigations. It showed Judge Brennan standing completely still, hands raised to shoulder height, while Kovac approached from behind. It showed him pulling her arms down roughly. It showed the handcuffs going on. It showed her being walked to the patrol car, while other customers watched in stunned silence. A man filling up his truck at the next pump called out, asking if everything was all right. Kovac told him to mind his business. A teenager working the register inside came to the door, phone already out and recording. Kovac didn't stop him, but his jaw tightened when he noticed. Judge Brennan was placed in the back of the patrol car at 9:51 p.m. 4 minutes from first contact to arrest. 4 minutes to destroy a career and trigger a federal civil rights investigation. The back seat smelled like industrial cleaner trying to mask something worse. The plastic seat was cracked and uncomfortable. Judge Brennan sat perfectly upright, staring straight ahead, her mind already working through what would happen next. She had sentenced people from her bench for civil rights violations. She had written opinions on unlawful detention and qualified immunity. She had lectured at law schools about Fourth Amendment protections. And now she was experiencing the other side of the system, handcuffed in a police car because an officer saw her skin color before he saw anything else. Kovac climbed into the driver's seat and picked up his radio. He reported that he had detained a suspect matching the description of the stolen vehicle call. Dispatch asked if he had confirmed the vehicle was stolen. Kovac said he was transporting the suspect to the station for processing. Dispatch asked again about the vehicle confirmation. Kovac didn't answer. The drive to the station took 8 minutes. Judge Brennan didn't speak. Kovac didn't either. The radio crackled with routine traffic. Another unit responding to a noise complaint. Someone requesting a tow truck. The mundane business of a Tuesday night, while a federal judge sat handcuffed in the back, her credentials sitting in her purse, her judicial ID in her wallet, all of it ignored. They arrived at the station at 10:03 p.m. Kovac walked Judge Brennan inside through the side entrance used for processing arrests. The booking area was busy with the usual evening chaos. 2 officers finishing paperwork. A woman arguing with someone on her phone. A man sleeping on a bench, apparently waiting for someone. Nobody looked twice at Kovac bringing in another arrest. The officer working the booking desk was named Sergeant Phyllis Dunham. She had 22 years on the force and had processed thousands of arrests. She was the first person that night who actually listened. When Kovac explained he had arrested a woman matching the description of a stolen vehicle suspect, Dunham asked to see the vehicle report. Kovac handed it over. Dunham read it slowly. Then she looked at Judge Brennan, still standing there in handcuffs, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Dunham made in a week. Something didn't add up. Dunham asked Kovac if he had confirmed the vehicle was actually stolen. He said he was bringing the suspect in for questioning first. Dunham asked if he had run the plates. The silence that followed answered her question. She turned to Judge Brennan and asked for her name. Judge Brennan provided it, along with her title. Dunham's eyes widened slightly. She asked if Judge Brennan had identification. The response was yes, in her purse, which was still in her vehicle back at the gas station. Dunham looked at Kovac with an expression that clearly communicated what she thought of his police work. Dunham excused herself and walked directly to the watch commander's office. Lieutenant Victor Salazar was finishing reports when Dunham knocked. The conversation that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but Salazar's face went through several distinct phases. Confusion, disbelief, anger. The kind of anger that comes from knowing your department is about to be destroyed in the press and the courts. Salazar came down to the booking area personally. He looked at Judge Brennan, still in handcuffs. He looked at Kovac, still convinced he'd done solid police work. Salazar asked one question. Did you confirm anything before making this arrest? Kovac started to explain his reasoning, but Salazar cut him off. The handcuffs came off Judge Brennan's wrists at 10:18 p.m., 31 minutes after they went on. Salazar apologized repeatedly while Dunham documented everything. Judge Brennan remained composed, but her first request made everyone in that booking area go silent. She wanted every piece of documentation related to her detention. Every report. Every radio communication. Every camera angle from the gas station and the police station. She wanted names, badge numbers, and the chain of command notifications. Salazar knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't going away quietly. Judge Brennan made one phone call from the station. Not to a lawyer, though she was one herself. Not to family. She called the chief judge of the federal district court, Margaret Holloway, who had appointed her to the bench 6 years earlier. The call lasted 90 seconds. Holloway's only response was a quiet, "I see," followed by, "Document everything. I'll handle the rest." By midnight, 3 things happened simultaneously. The Department of Justice received formal notification of a federal judge's unlawful detention. The State Attorney General's office got a courtesy heads-up that something significant was brewing. And the police chief, Raymond Foster, got woken up at home by a phone call that made him seriously consider early retirement. Foster arrived at the station at 12:40 a.m., wearing sweatpants and a department jacket. His first stop was Lieutenant Salazar's office, where he watched the gas station security footage. Then, the dash cam from Kovac's cruiser. Then, the body cam that Kovac apparently forgot he was wearing. Each video made Foster's expression darker. The facts were undeniable. Kovac had no reasonable suspicion. The vehicle wasn't stolen. The plates came back clean. Judge Brennan identified herself immediately. She offered her credentials. She asked for a supervisor. She complied with every command despite having zero legal obligation to do so. And Kovac arrested her anyway because in his mind, a black woman in an expensive car at night must be a criminal. Foster called Kovac into the office. The officer still thought he might get praised for being proactive. Instead, Foster suspended him on the spot. Badge and weapons surrendered immediately. Kovac started to argue, to explain his reasoning, but Foster wasn't interested. He'd seen enough officers destroy their careers through stupidity, but this was exceptional, even by those standards. Judge Brennan left the station at 1:15 a.m. She drove herself home in the same vehicle Kovac claimed was suspicious. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She didn't speak to the press waiting outside, didn't make a statement, just walked to her car with the same composed dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But composed didn't mean she was letting this go. Not even close. The next morning, Judge Brennan did something she'd never done in 6 years on the bench. She recused herself from every case on her docket for the next 2 weeks. Her clerk made the notifications. Lawyers scrambled to adjust. Other judges absorbed her cases. The legal community started asking questions. By noon, the story broke. Not because Judge Brennan leaked it. She didn't have to. Someone at the station talked. Then someone else. Then the gas station owner who'd watched the whole thing reviewed his security footage and decided the public needed to see what he saw. The footage hit social media before any official statement came out. The response was immediate and volcanic. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The State Bar Association expressed concern. Other federal judges who normally stayed out of public controversies made it known they were watching closely. Legal scholars wrote op-eds about judicial independence and police overreach. The story wasn't just local anymore. It was national. The police department tried damage control. They issued a statement about taking the matter seriously and conducting a thorough investigation. The words rang hollow. Everyone knew what the investigation would find because everyone had seen the videos. Kovac, sitting at home on suspension, still didn't fully grasp what he'd done. He told friends he was being thrown under the bus for political reasons, that he'd followed procedure, that anyone would have made the same call. He genuinely believed he was the victim here, punished for doing his job, in a world where police couldn't win no matter what they did. Meanwhile, Judge Brennan was building her case. Not in court yet. That would come. First, she documented everything. She wrote a detailed timeline from memory while it was fresh. She compiled every interaction, every statement, every moment from pulling into that gas station to walking out of the police station. Her legal training meant she knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. She also did something unexpected. She requested records of every traffic stop Kovac had made in the past 3 years. Public records, nothing requiring a warrant or subpoena. Just data that any citizen could access with the right request forms. The department had to comply. The patterns that emerged were damning. Kovac stopped black drivers at rates far exceeding his peers. His stops of black women specifically were off the charts. Most stops resulted in warnings or nothing at all, suggesting they lacked legitimate basis from the start. Several had generated complaints that went nowhere because they were marked unsubstantiated or unfounded. Judge Brennan wasn't the first person Kovac had done this to. She was just the first one with the resources, knowledge, and platform to do something about it. 2 weeks after the arrest, Judge Brennan filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. Not just against Kovac, against the department for inadequate training and supervision, against the city for policies that enabled this behavior, against everyone in the chain of command who'd seen Kovac's pattern and done nothing. The complaint was devastating. 43 pages of facts, legal theory, and documented evidence. It detailed not just what happened to Judge Brennan, but the systemic failures that made it possible. It included data showing Kovac's stop patterns. It referenced the complaints that were ignored. It outlined how supervisors failed to identify obvious problems. The legal community read it with something approaching awe. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a masterclass in federal civil rights litigation, written by someone who understood both sides of the bench. Judge Brennan had essentially written a blueprint for how these cases should be prosecuted. The city attorney read the complaint and immediately advised the mayor to settle. The case was unwinnable. The evidence was overwhelming. Taking it to trial meant putting Kovac on the stand, where he'd get destroyed on cross-examination. It meant the videos playing for a jury. It meant discovery that would expose every other problematic officer and policy the department had. But the mayor hesitated. Settling immediately looked like an admission of guilt. It looked weak. He wanted to fight, to defend the department, to show he supported law enforcement. The city attorney warned him this was a catastrophic miscalculation, but the mayor thought he knew better. That decision would haunt him. Judge Brennan's legal team, which now included 3 civil rights attorneys working pro bono, filed motion after motion. They requested everything: personnel files, training records, internal affairs investigations, use of force reports. They built a case that went far beyond one illegal arrest. They were going after the entire culture that made it possible. Discovery revealed things the department desperately didn't want public. Kovac had been flagged multiple times by supervisors for concerning behavior. Nothing was ever done. Other officers had complained about his aggressive approach. They were told to mind their business. Training on implicit bias was outdated and rarely enforced. The early warning system designed to catch problem officers was essentially ignored. The deeper the investigation went, the worse it got. This wasn't about one bad cop. It was about a department that enabled bad cops and ignored warning signs until something exactly like this happened. Judge Brennan watched it unfold with the same calm she'd shown in that gas station. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger was temporary and unproductive. She was focused, determined. She'd spent years on the bench seeing cases where people claimed police misconduct and struggled to prove it. Now she was on the other side, and she understood exactly how the system failed victims. She was going to make sure that system couldn't fail anyone else the same way. 6 months into litigation, the department's lawyers made their first serious mistake. During a deposition, they put forward Captain Vincent Cross, Kovac's direct supervisor, thinking he'd defend the department's training and oversight. Instead, under oath, Cross admitted he'd personally witnessed Kovac make questionable stops, but never filed formal reports because he didn't want to create paperwork that might hurt the officer's career. Judge Brennan's attorney let that statement hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before asking the next question. The deposition transcript read like a prosecution's dream. Cross had essentially admitted the department prioritized protecting officers over accountability. He'd seen problems and actively chose to hide them. When asked why, his answer was worse than silence. He said, "That's just how things worked. That everyone understood you didn't throw fellow officers under the bus over minor issues." Minor issues. That's what he called racially biased stops. The mayor received that transcript on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, he was ready to settle. But Judge Brennan had a different plan. She didn't want money. She wanted change. Her settlement demands included a complete overhaul of the department's early warning system, mandatory bias training every 6 months, body camera footage review protocols, an independent oversight committee with subpoena power, and policy changes that required supervisors to document and investigate any pattern of complaints against officers. The city balked. Those demands would cost millions to implement and fundamentally alter how the department operated. Judge Brennan's response was simple. Take it or see you in court, where a jury will award me twice what this costs and mandate the same changes anyway. She was right, and everyone knew it. A jury would see the videos, hear about Kovac's history, learn about the complaints that were ignored, and come back with a verdict that would devastate the city's budget and reputation, far worse than accepting these terms. 3 weeks of negotiations followed. The city tried to water down every demand. Judge Brennan refused to budge on the substantive changes, though she agreed to extend implementation timelines to make them financially feasible. She also agreed to a monetary settlement that was surprisingly modest, just enough to cover her legal fees and compensate for the violation she'd endured. This wasn't about getting rich. It was about making sure this couldn't happen to someone without her resources and knowledge. The settlement was announced on a Tuesday morning. The press conference was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and community members who'd been following the case. Judge Brennan stood at the podium, composed and precise as always, and explained what had been achieved. She talked about systemic change, accountability, and the responsibility of those in power to use it wisely. She never mentioned Kovac by name. She didn't need to. Everyone knew this case was bigger than one officer. Kovac himself had been fired 4 months earlier, right after Cross's deposition made headlines. The department announced his termination with a brief statement about conduct unbecoming an officer. No details, no admission of wrongdoing. Just a quiet exit that let them pretend they'd handled the problem internally. But the personnel file told a different story. Kovac was fired not just for the arrest of Judge Brennan, but for the pattern of behavior that arrest exposed. Internal Affairs had finally done the investigation they should have done years earlier. They'd found everything Judge Brennan's lawyers had found. Discriminatory stops, ignored complaints, warning signs that were never addressed. Kovac couldn't even fight the termination. His own body camera footage had destroyed any defense he might have mounted. His union rep took one look at the evidence and advised him to accept the firing and move on. There would be no arbitration, no appeal, no getting his job back. He was done in law enforcement forever. Some officers in the department were furious about the settlement. They saw it as the city throwing one of their own under the bus to appease activists. They complained the new policies would make it impossible to do their jobs, that they'd be second-guessed on every decision, that the Oversight Committee was just a witch hunt waiting to happen. But other officers, the ones who'd been doing their jobs correctly all along, welcomed the changes. They were tired of officers like Kovac making everyone look bad. They were tired of dealing with community distrust created by a few bad actors who never faced consequences. They understood that accountability protected good officers by weeding out bad ones. The implementation of the settlement terms took 18 months. The Oversight Committee was the most contentious piece. The department fought every aspect of its structure, trying to limit its authority and access. Judge Brennan's legal team threatened to go back to court multiple times before the committee finally launched with real power to investigate and make binding recommendations. The committee's first major action sent shockwaves through the department. They reviewed 3 years of body camera footage and identified 12 officers with concerning patterns. Not illegal necessarily, but problematic. Disproportionate stops of minorities, aggressive language, unnecessary escalation. These officers were flagged for additional training and closer supervision. 2 were eventually terminated after investigation revealed policy violations. The message was clear. The old way of doing things was over. But the real test came when the committee investigated a use of force incident that the department had already cleared as justified. An officer had tased a teenager during a traffic stop. The internal review found no policy violations. The committee disagreed. They looked at the full context, the officer's history, the lack of de-escalation attempts, and concluded the force was unnecessary. They recommended discipline. The police union exploded. This was exactly what they'd feared. Outside civilians overruling trained officers and tactical decisions. They threatened legal action, work slowdowns, everything in their playbook. The committee stood firm and released their full report publicly. The community read it and saw detailed analysis explaining exactly why the force was unjustified. They saw an oversight process that actually worked. The pressure on the department became overwhelming. Eventually, the chief implemented the committee's recommendations. The officer received a suspension and mandatory retraining. More importantly, the incident led to policy changes about when tasing was appropriate. The teenager's family, who'd been considering a lawsuit, accepted an apology and settlement after seeing the committee take their concerns seriously. Judge Brennan watched all of this unfold from her chambers. She'd returned to the bench 6 months after the settlement, assigned to a different jurisdiction to avoid any appearance of bias in cases involving the department. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of respect and awkwardness. Some admired what she'd done. Others thought she'd made their jobs harder by putting herself in the story rather than staying above it. She didn't care about their opinions. She'd done what needed to be done. 2 years after her arrest, Judge Brennan was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. She accepted. Her speech focused on something most people didn't want to acknowledge. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was designed to give enormous discretion to officers with minimal accountability. It was designed to protect law enforcement from consequences. It was designed to make it nearly impossible for victims to prove misconduct. Her arrest hadn't been an aberration. It was the system functioning normally. The only unusual part was that she had the knowledge and resources to fight back. She spoke about the dozens of people she'd sentenced over the years for resisting arrest or obstruction, wondering now how many of those arrests started exactly like hers did. She talked about the defendants who tried to explain they'd done nothing wrong, that the officer had no reason to stop them. She dismissed those claims as everyone did, assuming the officer must have had justification that simply wasn't articulated well in the report. Now she knew better. Those defendants might have been telling the truth. They might have been arrested for the same reason she was, for existing while black in a space where someone with a badge decided they didn't belong. The speech went viral. Conservative outlets attacked her for being anti-police. Progressive outlets celebrated her for speaking truth to power. She ignored both. She wasn't interested in being a symbol or a spokesperson. She was interested in results, in making sure the settlement terms were actually implemented and not just performed for show. 3 years post-arrest, the data started coming in. The department's stop patterns had shifted measurably. Officers were stopping fewer people overall, but those stops were more likely to result in actual enforcement action, suggesting they were better targeted. Complaints about discriminatory stops had dropped by 40%. Use of force incidents were down. The Oversight Committee had investigated 32 cases and found misconduct in 11 of them. Every single one of those findings led to discipline that stuck. The changes were working, but they were fragile. A new mayor could defund the committee. A new police chief could stop enforcing the policies. The union could negotiate away the reforms in the next contract. Judge Brennan understood this wasn't a permanent victory. It was a temporary shift that would require constant vigilance to maintain. That vigilance came from unexpected places. Community groups that formed during the controversy remained active, monitoring police interactions and documenting patterns. Law students volunteered to help people file complaints and navigate the process. Local journalists kept investigating, kept asking questions, kept holding officials accountable when they tried to backslide. Officer Vincent Hayes never fully recovered professionally. He left the department 18 months after the settlement, citing the hostile work environment created by what he called political interference in policing. He took a job 3 counties over as a deputy sheriff. Within 6 months there, he'd racked up 2 excessive force complaints. The pattern followed him because the pattern was him. Some people never learn. They just move. Judge Brennan saw him one more time, purely by chance. She was having coffee at a cafe when he walked in wearing his new uniform. Their eyes met across the room. He looked away first, grabbed his order, and left quickly. She wondered if he felt anything. Shame, anger, regret? Or if he'd convinced himself he was the real victim in all this. The financial cost of that arrest kept adding up in ways the city hadn't anticipated. The settlement was just the beginning. Insurance premiums for the police department increased dramatically. The city had to hire additional staff to manage the Oversight committee. Training costs multiplied. Legal fees for defending other cases piled up as more people came forward with complaints, emboldened by Brennan's successful lawsuit. One city council member tried to calculate the total cost during a budget hearing. Between the settlement, legal fees, increased insurance, new positions, training programs, and lost productivity from officers on leave, the arrest had cost taxpayers somewhere between $3 and $4 million. $4 million because one officer couldn't handle being questioned by a black woman. But the human cost was harder to quantify. Judge Brennan dealt with symptoms that lingered long after the physical injuries healed. She'd be driving and see a police car behind her, and her heart would race. She'd be in court, and an officer would approach too quickly, and she'd feel her body tense. She started therapy 6 months after the arrest, something she'd resisted initially because she thought she could handle it herself. The therapist helped her understand that what she experienced was trauma, and trauma doesn't respond to logic or willpower. Her brain had learned that police officers were dangerous, and no amount of knowing better intellectually could override that learned response. It took time, practice, and patience to retrain those reactions. Her family struggled too. Her sister became hypervigilant about police interactions, pulling out her phone to record whenever she saw officers talking to anyone. Her nephew, 15 years old, developed intense anxiety about driving once he got his learner's permit. He'd witnessed his aunt's arrest on video and internalized the message that even doing everything right wouldn't protect him. Judge Brennan tried to shield them from her worst moments, but families share pain whether they want to or not. Her mother, 73 years old, told her she'd stopped watching the news because every police shooting, every wrongful arrest, every video of violence made her think of what could have happened that night. What nearly did happen. The broader community felt the ripple effects as well. Trust between residents and police, already fragile, deteriorated further. People stopped calling for help with minor issues, afraid any interaction might escalate. Neighborhood watch programs dissolved because nobody wanted to work with officers anymore. The police blamed activists and the media for poisoning community relations. They never seemed to consider that their own actions might be the actual poison. 4 years after her arrest, Judge Brennan was assigned a case that brought everything full circle. A young man, 26 years old, was charged with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. The police report claimed he'd attacked them during a routine stop. The defense attorney presented body cam footage showing something completely different. The young man had asked why he was being stopped, and the officers escalated immediately, grabbing him when he didn't comply fast enough with contradictory commands. Judge Brennan watched the footage 3 times. She saw herself in that young man's confusion, his attempts to understand what was happening, his fear as the situation spiraled. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The defense attorney moved to dismiss based on lack of probable cause for the initial stop. The prosecutor argued the officers had reasonable suspicion based on the defendant matching a description. What description? Judge Brennan asked. The prosecutor pulled out the dispatch call. Black male, 20s to 30s, medium build, dark clothing. Judge Brennan looked at the defendant. She looked at the prosecutor. She asked if the prosecutor seriously believed that description justified stopping this specific person. The prosecutor hesitated, then fell back on officer discretion and training. Judge Brennan suppressed evidence obtained after the unlawful stop, which gutted the prosecution's case. She She dismissed the charges entirely. The young man cried when she explained he was free to go. His mother, sitting in the gallery, sobbed with relief. The prosecutor looked furious but said nothing. What could they say? The law was clear, even if it was rarely applied this way. After court, the young man's attorney thanked Judge Brennan. She didn't want thanks. She wanted a system where judges didn't have to be personally victimized before they understood what defendants had been saying all along. She wanted prosecutors who cared about justice more than conviction rates. She wanted officers who saw people as people, not threats to be controlled. But wanting and having are different things. The case got attention because of Judge Brennan's involvement. Legal analysts debated whether her personal experience created bias that should have required recusal. Others argued her experience gave her insight that made her better equipped to evaluate these cases fairly. The State Judicial Ethics Board received complaints but found no violation. Judges aren't required to recuse themselves just because they have relevant life experience. Still, Judge Brennan knew some people would always question her rulings in police misconduct cases. They'd assume she was biased against officers, unable to be objective. The irony was thick. Nobody questioned whether judges who were former prosecutors were biased in favor of police. Nobody suggested judges who came from law enforcement families should recuse themselves. But a judge who'd been unlawfully arrested? Suddenly, objectivity was a concern. 5 years after that parking lot encounter, Judge Brennan received a letter. It came to her chambers, handwritten on lined paper. The return address was from a prison 2 states away. She almost threw it away without reading it, assuming it was from an inmate asking for help with their case. Something made her open it anyway. The letter was from Vincent Hayes. He was writing from prison, serving a 4-year sentence for assault. He'd beaten a suspect during an arrest at his new department, and this time, there were multiple witnesses and clear video. This time, he couldn't talk his way out. The letter wasn't an apology exactly. It was more of an explanation, a rambling attempt to justify his actions by talking about the stress of the job, the dangers officers face, the split-second decisions required. Judge Brennan read it twice, looking for any hint of genuine remorse or understanding. She found none. Even from prison, Hayes was defending himself, portraying his violence as unfortunate but understandable. He ended the letter by saying he hoped she'd forgiven him and moved on with her life. She burned the letter in her office fireplace. Some things don't deserve preservation. That same year, the Oversight Committee released its 5-year report. The data showed measurable improvement in nearly every category. Stops were down, but more legally justified. Complaints were down. Use of force was down. Officer discipline was actually happening when misconduct was proven. The report concluded that civilian oversight, combined with mandatory training and real consequences, could change police culture. But the report also noted the fragility of these gains. Reforms required constant maintenance and political will. Without continued pressure and attention, departments would drift back toward old patterns. The work was never finished. Judge Brennan knew this better than anyone. Her arrest had sparked change, but sustaining that change required effort from countless people doing unglamorous work. Filing complaints, attending committee meetings, analyzing data, training officers, investigating misconduct, holding officials accountable. Change wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was 1,000 small actions repeated over time. She thought about that often when people asked if her arrest was worth it, if the settlement and reforms justified what she went through. The question bothered her because it assumed her trauma was a price paid for progress, as if the universe required Black women to be brutalized before society would pay attention. Her arrest shouldn't have been necessary. None of it should have happened. And the fact that it took a federal judge being unlawfully arrested on camera before the system responded proved exactly how broken things were. Ordinary people had been saying the same things for decades, but their voices didn't matter until someone with power and credentials experienced it personally. That was the real injustice. Not just what happened to her, but what had been happening to countless others who didn't have her resources or platform. People who were arrested, beaten, or killed, and nobody cared because they didn't have the right credentials or connections. People whose complaints were dismissed, whose videos were ignored, whose lives were destroyed by officers who faced no consequences. Judge Brennan returned to that parking lot once, 6 years after the arrest. She sat in her car and looked at the spot where Hayes had thrown her to the ground. The pavement had been repaved since then. No physical evidence remained of what happened there. But she remembered every second. The shock, the pain, the rage, the fear. She remembered knowing that her life could end right there, over nothing, and nobody would be held accountable. She started her car and drove away. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten. And she'd spend whatever time she had making sure that parking lot encounter meant something beyond her own pain. Making sure the reforms survived. Making sure other people didn't have to go through what she did before the system listened. Because if there was any purpose to be found in trauma, it was in preventing others from experiencing the same thing. That was the only justice that mattered. That's the weight of 31 minutes in handcuffs. A federal judge arrested for pumping gas while black. An officer so convinced of his own assumptions that he ignored every piece of evidence contradicting them. A system so broken that it took someone with power being victimized before anyone paid attention. The reforms are real but fragile. The Oversight Committee still functions, still investigates, still holds officers accountable. But every budget cycle brings new threats to defund it. Every election brings politicians promising to get tough on crime by getting soft on police accountability. The work continues because it has to, not because it's finished. Officer Kovac never worked in law enforcement again. Judge Brennan still serves on the federal bench. Those facts alone don't constitute justice, but they're a start. Real justice would be a system where federal judges and ordinary citizens receive the same protection from unlawful arrests. Real justice would be officers facing consequences before someone with credentials and connections forces the issue. The gas station still operates on that corner. People pump gas there every day, unaware they're standing where a federal judge was handcuffed for asking questions. The cameras still record, the lights still shine, and somewhere, someone else is being stopped for matching a description that's really just code for their skin color. The body cam footage from that night remains sealed per the settlement agreement. But everyone involved knows what it shows. An officer seeing what he expected to see instead of what was actually there. A judge maintaining composure while her rights were violated. 31 minutes that cost millions of dollars and changed an entire department's policies. That's the price of assumptions. That's the cost of unchecked authority. And that's what happens when someone finally has the power to make the system answer for what it's been doing all along. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there. Can't shut your mind off. And the next day you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills, no apps, no gadgets. Just a step-by-step plan that actually works. It's only $15. I put the link in the description if you want to check it out. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.